Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming. I'm Jennifer Jett, First Vice President here at the FCC, and I'm very happy to have Ambassador Sam Brownback with us today. Before we begin, just a reminder to please mute your phones, but feel free to tweet as much as you like. We're at FCCHK, that's our Twitter account. I'd also like to mention a few upcoming events that might interest you. Next week, we have a club lunch featuring Dr. Marie Mendres, a leading European scholar on Russia who will argue that the country under Putin is not as strong as we think. Second, on Saturday, March 16th, the club is holding a charity fundraiser to raise money for a program benefiting refugee children in Hong Kong. That should be a really great party for what I think is really good value. So take a look at that. And finally, the club's 4th annual journalism conference is a week later on Saturday, March 23rd. So be sure to check out the program and sign up for that because it's always a really good event. Today we have Sam Brownback, a former Kansas senator and governor who is now the U.S. Ambassador for International Religious Freedom. In 1998, he was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act that created this position, which is not unique to the United States, but also exists in the EU and the UK. His job is to promote religious freedom as a core objective of U.S. foreign policy, including monitoring religious persecution and discrimination worldwide. As ambassador, his work has included attending the trial of the American pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey and visiting Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. Today he'll be talking mostly about China, but in the Q&A I'm sure we can get into all sorts of issues. So please welcome Ambassador Brownback.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good morning. Delighted to join all of you this morning. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the New York Times, even though they haven't always given me fair coverage in my estimation. But they have covered, and they do cover, U.S. politics and things that happen all over the world, and we are appreciative of what all the work is that they do, and they're doing a great job. I have been in public life for some period of time, and I got reminded of that last week at the UN. I was speaking to a group there, working with people on religious freedom, and the waiter at the end of the breakfast, or the end of the luncheon, wanted to meet me. And so I shook his hand, and he was just very excited to meet me and see me, and he said, "Gosh, I've never met a vintage U.S. politician." And I thought, you know, I guess vintage, well, I said that to my kids, that I was called a vintage American politician. And I said to my kids, I guess that's an insult. And they said, no, vintage is in, so this is good. And I'm going to take it as a compliment. I'll see how it plays out over time. It's a pleasure to have all of you here, and thank you for giving me this platform to speak. I know it is of no small task on your part, nor that this is an important thing, that you give somebody like me in a position like I am, a position and opportunity to speak. And so thank you for doing that, and I deeply appreciate this chance to speak. I also appreciated the home touch from back home. There's a gentleman over here that spent summers in my home state of Kansas, and of course, if you're from that area, you're going to talk about a couple of different things. One would be basketball, because we kind of developed the sport. The inventor moved to Kansas, and so we really claim basketball. And the second is barbecue, which we have the best in the world, and anybody that wants to argue with me, I invite you to come to Kansas and try it. And we will see how that goes, because I think you'll like ours. I visited Hong Kong several times. Every time I'm here, I'm impressed by its vibrant economy, beautiful scenery, its fascinating culture. This is a world-class city like no other. There's also something that happens here that I would like to see happen in many other places, and that is that followers of nearly every religion in the world are here, and they are peacefully practicing their faith in whatever way they see fit. Here in Hong Kong, people can worship free from the fear of persecution that unfortunately is all too common in many parts of the world. So Hong Kong should really serve as an example of religious freedom for other governments in the region and around the world to follow. Now, I'm going to go through my remarks, and they are in-depth. I want to lay out an in-depth case for you, and I'm going to be happy to take questions afterwards. But I would suggest you may want to get a second cup of coffee. It's early on a Friday morning, if that's the case, or order it in the period of time you're here. If you lose interest, just take a nap. It won't be wasted time. I'd like to begin by expressing my profound respect and admiration of the Chinese people. My youngest daughter, my wife and I's youngest daughter, is from China. We adopted her when she was 18 months old, and she's now a junior at Baylor University, and she is a delight of our lives. We're very proud of her. China has an impressive culture and many contributions to mankind. So as I receive reports about the suffering Chinese people of faith that they are experiencing, I cannot help but wonder why the Chinese Communist Party does not trust its own people to allow them to choose their own path with their own souls, particularly with over 1 billion plus souls at stake. It seems the Chinese government is at war with faith. It is a war they will not win. During this speech, I'll express a number of concerns the United States has about the religious freedom situation in mainland China. This is out of a lament, not anger. We highly regard the Chinese people for all their contributions to mankind in the past, in the present, and I'm sure in the future. But I do have some basic questions. What does the Chinese Communist Party have to fear from its faithful people? Why can't it trust its people with the Bible? Why can't Uighur children be named Muhammad? Why can't the Tibetans choose and venerate their own religious leaders like they have for more than 1,000 years? Why? Sadly, people living in mainland China do not enjoy the religious freedom people here in Hong Kong do. The Chinese government continues to violate the sacred right to religious freedom that is in its constitution and also enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Since 1999, the United States has designated China as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. This is our most concerning category for countries violating religious freedom. This is for having engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. Now, at the outset, to be clear as well, it is my desire that China get off the CPC list by changing its practices. And in case you just think I'm here to talk about China, I recently traveled to Pakistan, another CPC country, to deliver a similar message of a desire for them to get off the CPC list and to work with them to do that. We would be happy to work with China to get off this list of countries of particular concern. Nonetheless, as we have in the past, we will continue to speak out against violations of religious freedom around the world. As Vice President Mike Pence said at the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom last year, the first ever held, and we will hold it again this year in July, he said this, quote, "The right to believe or not believe is the most fundamental of freedoms. When religious liberty is denied or destroyed, we know that other freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of press, of assembly, and even democratic institutions themselves are imperiled." That's why the United States of America stands for religious freedom yesterday, today, and always. We do this because it is right. But we also do this because religious freedom is in the interest of the peace and security of the world. Now, we've all watched China emerge onto the international stage. I first traveled to China in, I believe it was 1985. I believe the efforts by the Chinese government to exert control over members of countless religious groups, often along ethnic lines, through the enforcement of religious affairs regulations. They do the destruction of houses of worship, the unlawful imprisonment of religious leaders, and actions to ruthlessly silence any forms of constructive dissent. This demonstrates its disregard for the individual dignity of every Chinese citizen. In that spirit, I want to talk about the concerns the U.S. government has, and specifically about the deteriorating state of religious freedom in mainland China. Over the last few years, we have seen increasing Chinese government persecution of religious believers from many faiths and from all parts of the mainland. And the world is taking notice. Let me start in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It is alarming that the Chinese government authorities have arbitrarily detained members of Muslim minority groups in internment camps for reasons including common religious practices such as having a beard, wearing a veil, attending services, observing Ramadan, sharing religious writings, or even praying. Since April 2017, mainland authorities have detained more than 1 million ethnic Muslims. They have targeted and forcibly relocated to internment camps Uighurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and members of other Muslim minority groups. Family members do not know the whereabouts of their loved ones or even whether they are dead or alive. The Trump administration is deeply concerned and considers this oppression a deliberate attempt by Beijing to redefine and control members of these Muslim minority groups' identity, culture, and faith. Now, China describes these sprawling camps with guard towers and barbed wires as simply vocational training centers. I believe we need to call these camps what they are. They're internment camps, created to wipe out the cultural and religious identity of minority communities. Numerous reports indicate that mainland authorities force innocent people into these camps, often based primarily on their religious beliefs and ethnic identity. The international community is seeing this, and the international press is covering it. I just read 2 articles this past weekend, one in the New York Times and one in Washington Post about it. They're then held in these camps for an indeterminate amount of time and subjected to physical and psychological torture, intense political indoctrination, and forced labor. In November, a survivor of one of these camps told the U.S. Congress that she was brutally tortured and witnessed at least 9 other innocent women in her cell die in just a few months. The same woman was separated from her triplets, and tragically, one of her children died while being held in Chinese government custody. Beyond the camps, the Chinese government also represses people in Xinjiang, restricting travel, monitoring their every move by using a high-tech Orwellian surveillance system, and banning certain religious practices. The government even bans children from participating in religious services and prohibits parents from naming their children common Islamic names. Now, China has long used its economic weight to silence criticism of its severe human rights abuses. I applaud the countries that have spoken out against China's abuses in Xinjiang. Turkey recently issued a strong condemnation of the human rights crisis there. More countries should do so. China justifies its use of internment camps and other repressive practices by claiming that it is rooting out terrorism preemptively. But China is not solving the terrorist problem by forcing and forcibly moving women, children, and the elderly, and a highly educated intelligentsia into mass detention centers and internment camps. Instead, they are creating one. The magnitude of these detentions is completely out of proportion to any real threat China faces from extremism. Even according to China's own official media and police reports, Xinjiang had not even reported a large-scale extremist incident for more than a year and a half before the detentions expanded after March of 2017. Rather, the Chinese government actions are intended to ensure that distinct ethnic and religious peoples are brutally and forcefully controlled. Why? Because they're different. Based on the testimony of survivors, it is clear that China's misguided and cruel policies in Xinjiang are creating resentment, hatred, division, poverty, and anger. To use a Chinese official's own words, this is essentially fertilizing the soil that breeds terrorism. In Tibet, China's oppression of religious believers is not limited to Muslim Uighurs. Chinese government attacks believers of nearly every faith in every region of China. In Tibet, China continues its decade-long policies of aggressively interfering with Tibetan Buddhist practices and Tibetan culture. Domestic and overseas restrictions on both lay people and Tibetan Buddhist monastics hinder traditional religious pilgrimages. Chinese authorities have appointed Chinese Communist Party cadres to lead local monasteries while banning Tibetan children from practicing in religious activities. The Chinese government has pushed thousands of monks and nuns out of their homes and bulldozed their monasteries. In 2017, the government evicted approximately 9,000 monks and nuns from the Falun Gong Institute of Tibetan Buddhism and demolished an estimated 4,000 residents there. The same year, authorities destroyed at least 2,000 residents and evicted approximately 2,500 monks and nuns at Yatsengar Institute of Tibetan Buddhism. Chinese officials have also withheld public benefits from family members and friends of Tibetans who self-immolated in protest against China's political and religious oppression. The government has ordered friends and monastic personnel to refrain from participating in religious burial rites or mourning activities for the self-immolators. In addition, the Chinese government has repeatedly denigrated His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetans and many others around the world. The Chinese government bans his picture and his teaching. It arrests people who openly revere him. According to reports, authorities subject monks and nuns to patriotic re-education at many monasteries and nunneries across the Tibetan plateau, forcing these religious leaders to be proficient in state ideology and to denounce the Dalai Lama. Chinese government has also long interfered in the succession process for spiritual leaders in Tibet, most notably when in 1995 it abducted the 11th Panchen Lama, Gaidon Chukyi Nihima, when he was 6 years old, along with his parents. The world still doesn't know if the Panchen Lama is dead or alive. He'd be celebrating his 30th birthday next month. Following the abduction, the Chinese government asserted its own choice as the Panchen Lama, and that child grew up in Beijing. The Chinese government only allows him to have brief, supervised visits to the Panchen Lama's traditional monastery in Shingatse, and that's for photo ops. We call upon the Chinese government to release immediately the Tibetan-recognized Panchen Lama, or share the truth about his faith with the world, his fate with the world. We do not accept the Chinese government's often repeated explanation that he is studying and does not want to be disturbed. This is the Chinese government's record, and it indicates that they are likely to interfere with the selection of the next Dalai Lama. The international community must make clear now that we believe that members of the Tibetan communities, like members of all faith communities, should be able to select, educate, and venerate their religious leaders without government interference. The Chinese government has also increased its repression of Christians. Last year, mainland China began enforcing amended regulations for religious affairs. And those regulations give the government more power to control where people worship, with whom they worship, and what content of their worship is. Since those regulations came into force, the crackdown on Christianity has increased dramatically. Starting on Good Friday last year, Chinese officials began to enforce a ban on the online sale of Bibles. And you just have to ask a question. Why is the Chinese government afraid of the Bible? With regard to the Catholic communities, we've heard reports that authorities in Hunan province have prohibited all people under the age of 18 from entering Catholic churches to attend Mass. In September, the Roman Catholic Church reached a provisional agreement with the Chinese government regarding an appointment process for bishops. Dozens of bishop appointments are vacant. Some are positions with large dioceses that have been empty for several years. Although details have not been made public, the agreement reportedly allows the state-run Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, the CCPA, to choose a slate of candidates for a vacant bishop position. The Vatican reportedly can only select from one of the candidates the CCPA selects. Therefore, the power to select the leaders of the Catholic Church in China rests partially with the Chinese Communist Party, which likely results in only individuals whom the party deems loyal to its interests being put forth to the Vatican. Members of the Catholic community, such as the Hong Kong Cardinal Joseph Zen, somebody I presume a number of you in this room know, courageously and vehemently opposed this deal. We remain concerned about the precedent this deal sets for the Chinese Communist Party's perceived authority in interfering in the selection of other religious leaders, such as I previously mentioned, Tibetan Buddhism's lamas, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Since this provisional deal was announced last year, the Chinese government's abuse of members of the Catholic community has continued. We see no signs that will change in the near future. In Zhejiang province, observers estimate that from 2014 to 16, the Chinese government destroyed more than 2,000 crosses and Christian churches. In the same province today, there are reports of officials pressuring believers to renounce their Christian faith. Media reports also indicate that over the last year, government authorities throughout China have forcibly closed hundreds of unregistered churches from house church Protestant and underground Catholic communities. To give just a few recent examples, in September, Beijing authorities ordered the closing of the 1,500-member Zion Church. A few months later, authorities shut down the 40-year-old Rongwei Li Church in Guangzhou, Guangdong province. In Chengdu, government authorities forcefully detained over 200 members of the Early Rain Covenant Church in Sichuan province, and it was the largest house church in that province. And this was for commemorating the 2008 earthquake in Wenchuan. 7 months later, in December 2018, government authorities once again arrested more than 100 Early Rain members, confiscated the church's Bibles and other religious materials, and permanently closed the church. At least a dozen remain detained, and their whereabouts and health conditions remain unknown, while the Chinese authorities prevent them from seeing their family members or even talking with their lawyers. Meanwhile, the government continues to monitor, harass, and in some cases physically assault family members of the detainees and prevents them from worshiping in even small groups. In one case, a security official kicked the elderly mother of the Early Rain lead pastor, Wang Yi, until she collapsed on the ground and was violently ripping her hair. The authorities have detained both parents of several infants and toddlers, meaning these young children are residing with relatives, but without any knowledge of whether or not they will ever see their family, their fathers and mothers again, or even know if their parents are still alive. Chinese authorities have charged Pastor Wang Yi and his wife, Zhang Wang, with inciting subversion of state power. China is using baseless political charges to attack individuals for simply practicing their faith. Pastor Wang instructed his followers to release his, quote, Declaration of Faithful Disobedience, which I urge all of you to read. It's an amazing letter. And he instructed them to do this if authorities detained him for more than 48 hours. Chinese authorities have detained Pastor Wang a number of times already for his courage and outspokenness, including most recently for initiating a nationwide campaign reiterating house churches' refusal to register with the government-backed Three Self-Patriotic movement. His words and call to action for how Christians should carry out what he calls faithful disobedience, distinct from political or civil disobedience, inspires me and many others. We believe that Chinese authorities wanted to send a message to others who dare follow in his footsteps and defy the Communist Party. But as a man of faith myself, I think the Chinese Communist Party may have done the opposite. When faith is under attack, it grows stronger. In scriptures and throughout church history, we see persecution sparking resolve and perseverance in the faith. The resolve of the Early Rain Covenant church community and countless others facing severe persecution is unshaken because they know that fighting for their right to freely exercise their beliefs is not wrong, no matter how heavy-handed the punishment and severe the mistreatment. I stand here today in support of Pastor Wang, his wife, and other members of their church and call on the Chinese authorities to release them immediately. I also stand here in support of Pastor John Sao. His wife Jamie is an American citizen, and she is a bold advocate for Pastor Sao's release. Pastor Sao provided aid and education to disadvantaged children in China and Burma. That's what he did. He was arrested, and today he's in a 26 by 10-foot cell with a dozen other prisoners. He's permitted to see sunshine just once a month. His wife and sons aren't allowed to visit him. We call as well again for his immediate release. Finally, Chinese government oppression also extends to the Falun Gong, whose abuse has been well documented. The Chinese government detains and reportedly tortures Falun Gong practitioners, with credible estimates putting the number of Falun Gong practitioners in prison in the thousands. The Falun Gong estimates that in 2018 alone, at least 69 Falun Gong practitioners died in Chinese government custody or due to injuries they sustained while in custody. Allegations persist that the Chinese government continues to forcibly harvest organs from prisoners held on account of their faith, like Falun Gong practitioners and Uighurs. Data from brave, persistent researchers raise concerning questions regarding the organ transplantation system in China, with voluntary donations unable to meet the demand. This is a truly horrifying prospect. We will continue to advocate for the Chinese government to end abuse and mistreatment of Falun Gong practitioners. This has lasted for more than 20 years and must stop. Also, they must address the whereabouts of missing practitioners. The Chinese Communist Party must hear the cries of its own people for religious freedom and act to correct this wrong. The Chinese people are great people. Someday soon, they will be free to practice their faith. The gates of religious freedom will fly open in China, and the Iron Curtain of religious persecution will come down. The Chinese government is currently on the wrong side of history, but this will change. The United States and other nations are bringing together government and religious leaders from around the world to promote religious freedom for all. We created the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom last July, specifically to advance this cause. Secretary Pompeo has already announced that the next Ministerial will take place on July 16th to 18th in Washington. We're also working with other governments and groups around the world to host follow-on regional conferences that focus on religious freedom issues specific to that area. Last month, I had the privilege of speaking at the first of these in Abu Dhabi. There, the topic was promoting religious freedom and interfaith tolerance in education materials. This weekend, I'll travel to Taipei, where the next conference will take place. It will include civil society representatives from all over East Asia and Pacific region. More are planned in Europe, Mongolia, and Latin America. The goal is to infuse religious freedom as a priority among governments and among civil society and religious groups worldwide. We hope you will join in that effort. We hope you'll attend the Ministerial in Washington, D.C. this coming July. Through all of our efforts, we are chasing a simple but important dream: that one day all peoples around the world will be able to worship freely and believe what they want, just like you can here in Hong Kong. We invite the rest of the world to join us in achieving this goal. As the detained pastor of the Early Rain Church, Wang Yi said, quote, "In Xinjiang, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Chengdu, the rulers have chosen an enemy that can never be imprisoned: the soul of man." Thank you for your time today. Thank you to the Foreign Correspondents Club for hosting me. God bless you and us in our joint efforts to have religious freedom for all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownback. I know we'll get a lot of questions about China, but before I open it up to the audience, I want to ask you about another major regional issue. The Rohingya crisis has been widely condemned as a genocide, including by the U.S. House of Representatives. And the Trump administration has previously used the word genocide to describe the Islamic State's persecution of Christians and Shiite Muslims. So can you tell us what's stopping the U.S. government from using the term genocide to describe the events in Myanmar, and do you think it should?
Well, the prior Secretary of State had made a determination of this being an ethnic cleansing, and other issues are under review. The United States has put a great deal of effort and money into trying to help the Rohingya. I visited there personally. The UN representative, Nikki Haley, has visited there personally as well. I've met with Rohingya refugees. We've had them present at the Ministerial. The issue is currently still being reviewed aggressively by the United States government. It made that early determination early in the crisis, and we're continuing to work to pursue a rightful solution for the Rohingya. The difficulty in obvious ways has been that the Rohingya have been persecuted by Myanmar for decades in various capacities, in various ways. They've been withheld food, medicine, education material, and to get them to be able to move back, but into an existence that's a meaningful human existence and be safe and be able to practice their faith has not been forthcoming by Myanmar, and that's been a key effort that people have had. This issue continues to be a lively one discussed, and I look for further discussions of it taking place.
Questions? Yeah, Chapman.
Yes, Chairman Chen from local press. Dear Ambassador, there are religious leaders in Hong Kong who are members of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, and also there are even members of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese government. So, and some of them are in fact speaking out against freedom of speech in Hong Kong. For example, an archbishop recently asked, why are you Hong Kong people always speaking out for democracy? Why? Even Jesus remained silent as a sheep waiting to be slaughtered when he was sentenced to death. So my question is, how would the United States government treat such religious leaders in Hong Kong, because they may be endangering religious freedom in Hong Kong? Thank you, sir.
Well, I'm not going to address the issue of democracy activists within this, because often people will conflate issues in this space, and they'll conflate democracy and religious freedom, and then at the end of the day you don't do anything on either. I'm talking about religious freedom, and that's what my portfolio is, and that's what I will stand for. And I believe in democracy and democratic institutions, but I think it's wrong to push them together. My push in China is to ask that they would change their religious freedom practices so that people can freely practice their faith. And we would be happy to work with the Chinese government on a route forward to change that. Just as I said, I was recently in Pakistan offering that same work with that nation on a route forward. We took Uzbekistan last year off of the country of particular concern list. This is that lowest category of nations that we're concerned about, after working with them, with the UN Special Representative on Religious Freedom, and getting a game plan in place, and then them working and letting a number of religious prisoners out of jail, stopping house raids, a series of things that they did, and they got off the list. They're on special watch, but they're off of the CPC list. That's the effort that I want to be a part of here, and not conflate these issues with democracy advocates.
One thing I forgot to say is please identify yourself when you ask the question. Yeah, in the front. Yeah.
Good morning, Ambassador. I'm Dennis Kwok. I'm a member of the Legislative Council here representing the legal profession. The only reason why me and my wife and kids can go to church here on Sunday without fear of arrest and persecution is because Hong Kong still has the rule of law, and that protects religious freedom. And because we have the one country, two systems, that is what makes us apart and different from China. Now, what would the American government do, actively do, to support one country, two system, and to ensure that the rule of law and religious freedom will continue to have a place in our lives in Hong Kong? Again,
Dennis, I don't want to conflate these issues. each of them have enough difficulty. The United States supports the one country, two systems policy, has from the outset of it. I've thought that it's a great thing to show the rest of the world, and certainly China, that they can work with a place like Hong Kong that has freedom of religion and that practices this actively, and it's not a threat to the authorities in Hong Kong. That's what I'm here to talk about, is that this is currently taking place in China today. In China, there is freedom of religion in Hong Kong. And this needs to be maintained, and it needs to continue. And it's not a threat to the authorities that you go to church on Sunday, or that you can buy a Bible, or that you can name your children whatever you choose to, or that you're not scared of going into an internment camp. That's just not the case with the rest of the countries. But we continue to support the one country, two systems policy that's been in place here since the turnover from the British of Hong Kong to China.
Yeah, in the corner.
My name's David McIntyre. Do you see an issue of, sort of off of Dennis's question, with the one country, two systems, and after the 50 years, that China may clamp down on religious freedom in Hong Kong? And also, do you see Christianity or other religions permeating the leadership in China more?
Obviously, that's a concern about what happens after 50 years. But the trend of history is for religious freedom, not for religious persecution. People desire to be free, and they operate best when they are free. And that's why I said at the end of this, very aspirationally, that Chinese people will experience religious freedom, and soon. Because that's where history is going, is to allow people to freely, peacefully, not violently, peacefully to practice their faith. So I'm concerned about what would happen after 50 years, but the trend line of people around the world is towards freedom, not away from it. The issue about Christianity permeating leadership in China, I wouldn't have a comment on to be able to address that particular issue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome back to Hong Kong, Ambassador.
No, thank you. It's good to be back.
When you were still serving in the U.S. Senate, 15 years ago, you organized and held a hearing on Hong Kong. In fact, a star witness of that hearing is in the room today.
Yes, he is.
I wonder whether you would care to share with us your view on recent developments in Hong Kong or the current state of affairs, not on religious freedoms. So it's overall a general state of one country, two system, and other aspects in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Yeah, I would. We've got the Consul General is here, and he's more competent to speak out on this issue now. I have a narrow portfolio, and I am intense about it, and it's an important portfolio. You know, most of the people in the world are religious. This is, I think, Pew numbers, that 80% of the world's population claims a religious affiliation. 80%. Now, I don't know that that's accurate. That's not a U.S. number, but it's a high percentage. And so the portfolio I'm working is very important to a vast majority of the world's people. And a lot of people, maybe they're in countries that they can practice religious freedom, or in places like Hong Kong where this is not an issue. But unfortunately, most of the world is not in a situation like that, and they are restricted. And remember, too, this isn't just a notion from the United States. This isn't just us saying that you should pursue religious freedom, even though it is in our DNA. Our very founders, when they came, they were seeking religious freedom at that time. But this is in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, freedom to worship as you see fit, there's freedom to change faiths if you choose, the freedom not to believe at all if you choose as well. So and then we also look at this as In Hong Kong and Abu Dhabi is actually a good example of this too. The more a place embraces religious freedom, it helps economic growth and it helps security. And this is in academic papers now. More religious freedom. You go to Abu Dhabi now. You can go throughout the Middle East and there's not a lot of religious freedom. You can go to Abu Dhabi. I went to Mass in Abu Dhabi on Sunday morning. Had no trouble other than the traffic was kind of bad. But there was no security issues. They just recently had the Pope have an outdoor Mass for the first time ever on the Arabian Peninsula, that a Pope celebrated an outdoor Mass. It was phenomenal. And they're very proud of that. And look at how they're growing. And it's not just based on oil. It's based upon a diverse growing economy where people are attracted from all over the world to come to be able to practice what they want to do, but then also to pursue economic interest. The same as in Hong Kong. The security is the same issue. You see more repressive areas having more security, more terrorism. Less repressive having less. It really is something that these are maybe counterintuitive to people, but freedom is the best. Freedom of religion is best for economic growth and for security as well.
Ernst Erb, Finanz- und Wirtschaft, the Swiss business publication. Since you mentioned the Arab world, you went to Abu Dhabi. Just across the border from Abu Dhabi is Saudi Arabia, one of the most intolerant countries in the world, where not even churches, synagogues, or Buddhist temples are allowed, or not even worship.
Get that mic on your mouth.
No worship other than Islam is allowed in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the closest allies of the United States economically, militarily. When are you planning to go to Saudi Arabia to deliver this message there, as you do here in Hong Kong? And secondly, if you do not go there, do you think you're undermining the message you're bringing here to Hong Kong?
As you may know, or maybe you don't, we listed Saudi as a country of particular concern as well. It's on our list, our CPC list too, of one of the most repressive religious atmospheres and places in the world. That's not been hidden, and they are an ally of the United States, and they're there on the list, and they're going to stay there as long as they don't change the repressive practices. The Secretary himself, Secretary Pompeo, has been delivering this message to the Saudis about the need to address religious persecution in that country. Part of being in UAE is to urge people in that neighborhood that you can have a religiously free atmosphere and still be a dominant population of Muslims. You don't have to fear religious freedom if you're in a Muslim-populated country. You can have that freedom. And part of the best messaging I think that I can deliver is to say, look at your neighbor here and look at how they are growing. Saudi Arabia seeks now to diversify its economy and to grow. It has a young population that needs economic opportunities beyond the oil field. And we're suggesting, as I am here in Hong Kong, that you can have religious freedom and still be a majority, strong majority Muslim country. That's what the message I was giving there, and the message that we're delivering to the Saudis as well. If having the opportunity, I would go to Saudi Arabia and address the same message there. But I do think the way to do it is as here, where you're holding up a regional example of there's nothing to fear from religious freedom. And that's the same thing I would do there.
Natasha.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownback. This is Natasha Khan from the Wall Street Journal. I have two questions. One of them is, what are specific measures that you're pushing or recommending the Trump administration to pursue to address the crisis in Xinjiang? And second, have you asked to visit the region? And if so, what has been the response to those requests?
We don't discuss internal matters about what's being discussed for possible actions in any place around the world, and would be the same for Xinjiang. Had staff members request to go into Xinjiang and haven't been able to do that yet, haven't been allowed that opportunity. We'd welcome the opportunity to go, but also to go into the internment camps and to see what's taking place there. I get regularly now, every week, lists of names of people that are held in prison, in internment camps in Xinjiang from concerned family members. Dozens, hundreds of names that people that are seeking just to know what's happened to their relative. The report from the New York Times over the weekend and the Washington Post were interviewing ethnic Kazakhs that had gotten out back to Kazakhstan, reporting on what had taken place in the country, and a number of ethnic Kazakhs that are being held as well in the detention camps. So I would like to have the opportunity to go, but not to just be given a show. I want to get into the actual camps themselves and talk with people and interview them freely.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah, here in the front.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mirek Adamczyk, Consul General of Poland here in Hong Kong. Ambassador, extremely interesting talk, but I have just two simple questions. First, you expressed some hope that one day, sooner or later, Chinese government will change its approach. My question is, what is the base for the hope, just apart from the hope itself? Because Chinese government seems to be, firmly believes, or at least pretends to believe, that it's on the right track regarding that, so far. So it doesn't have any needs to change. I will compare to the political development and constitutional and democratic reform in Hong Kong. When I came first in Hong Kong 2014, it was during the umbrella movement, and many people firmly believe that it's a sign that Chinese government may think Hong Kong as a, let's say, training field for democratic reforms. I mean, later on we just noticed and experienced that it's rather like a battlefield than a training field. So it's the first question, what is the ground for the hope? And second question is, has ever Chinese government approached US government and for any talks to be removed from CPC list? Express an interest.
The answer to the second question is I'm not familiar with any time that they've approached us asking to be off the CPC list. As I stated, I would invite the chance to discuss this issue with them and to develop a track, a way that we have done with other countries, the two countries that I mentioned previously. It's a legitimate question of what do you base your hope on? I base that on just the fundamental nature of mankind, honestly. People want to be free. They really do. And that's not just an American or a European value, that's a worldwide value. The people want to be free. And that you're not going to crush that yearning within the human spirit. It's like the Pastor Wang Yi said, you've picked a war you can't win. You're going to try to imprison the soul of man. You can't do it. It won't work. So I base it on that. And it's also, I think, as increasingly the information gets out that if you want to grow, and China wants to grow, its economic growth has been one of the key powers that it has used the last 20 years. That came from them opening up their economy to a lot of outside investment, to a lot of other things. If you want to grow, you're going to have to open up. You're going to have to be willing to have other people of different thoughts come in. You can't control people of faith. They are going to pursue their path. So, if you want it more tangible than that, I'm not going to be able to put it in front of you. I will give you a tangible example. When Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, bring down this wall," he didn't have a single bulldozer around, and that wall came down that day. Now, it took some time for it physically to be removed, but just the statement of something that was true, that resonated with the people, created. And it was a powerful speech, and it was a powerful moment for the world. It was a powerful moment for Poland when he did that. I believe in the power of the spoken word to create. And I believe as people in China say, I want to be free. I want to be free to practice my faith the way I see fit. It will create. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownback. We also have a small gift for you. Thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, have a good day. I'm not entirely sure what this is.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for hosting.
Yeah, that was great.